Greetings, trackers. Welcome back to Adjust Tracking, the RPL Film Theater's VHS night, hosted by yours truly, Jon Vaughn. For the 87th edition, we'll be experiencing The Alien Agenda, Out of the Darkness, the first in a trilogy of films made by Kevin Lindenmuth, released in 1996. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us for the 30th anniversary presentation of Out of the Darkness. For those who don't know, Kevin is a prolific filmmaker, particularly in the horror genre. Kevin, what inspired you to initiate a trilogy of films around the classic science fiction trope of alien invasion? I did notice that you considerably updated the treatment for the context of 90s UFO culture, with Out of the Darkness taking place 50 years after the culmination of an extraterrestrial project, which in your story has transformed human society.
John, thanks for having me. To answer your question about what inspired the Alien Agenda trilogy and this movie, Alien Agenda Out of the Darkness, which is the first one, is I always liked alien movies. And, this is the fourth independent film I made. And the first three involve vampires somehow. The first one was vampires and other stereotypes. Then I did one called Addicted to Murder, which was a little bit different type of vampire. And then in between those two, I did an anthology, which actually had yet another type of vampire in it. So I sort of did the vampire thing. I did take a break, really liked aliens. And of course, this was the mid 90s. And, I was thinking of something to do that I could actually make a series out of. And, what better to do than an alien series? Because I loved X-Files. I grew up watching reruns of the Invaders, that show from the 60s, the late 60s. And I like that whole idea. So I came up with this whole scenario. I knew filmmakers that I could get to make, segments. So it was basically like an anthology. It was going to be like an anthology, but sort of disguised. So I could get different people working on it at the same time. So basically, while I was doing Alien Agenda Out of the Darkness, I was actually working on the other two movies to one extent or the other. Because what helped form them was for that two of the movies used pre-existing films that were made years before. In Alien Agenda Out of the Darkness, it was Mick McCleary's movie Limited Vision, and that's like the black and white segment that you'll see. And that sort of dealt with the doppelganger and, duplicates and stuff. And that sort of fit with sort of what my outline was for this alien series, that were these aliens sort of using people as tools to infiltrate, the regular humans and just sort of mess things up for people. And so that really fit. And it was sort of vague, and it was creepy. And I really liked that. I had that in mind. So that helped, inform these movies because I had to base the other two stories on that sort of feel of that movie, as I did with the second movie that used a segment that was done like 10 years before or something out in Las Vegas, and I sort of made that fit. And I think they all, flow pretty well. But they, I wanted this really uneasy feeling about them. I wanted them to be like a little vague, like the X-Files, because the X-Files really never explained anything to really any satisfaction. But I always wanted to, like, at the end of these movies, make it very clear what was going on. And I wanted to do that with these first three, but then it turned out to a whole other alien series that I'll talk about in a little bit. So it was pretty cool. So I really enjoyed working on this. And it was a little bit challenging, sort of tackling the whole alien, genre because, that was really popular at the time. And of course, you had to have the UFOs, you had to have the aliens. Um, so I wanted to keep it interesting, not just to me, because I've seen like every alien movie out there, up until that time. I needed to keep it, interesting to all the people who are going to be watching this, because at this time, independent films were really getting shown in the video stores. And I had great luck, I guess you would call it, with one of my vampire movies, and I got it into Blockbuster. So that was a big foot in with getting like, thousands of these, VHS tapes into the store. And, I thought this would be a really good shoe-in. And, it didn't do quite as well as the vampire thing, but, people saw these movies and it was, exactly what I hoped. You know, you're making these movies for an audience. You want them to see it and you want it to get as wide, a view as possible. And then, of course, getting people I knew, other filmmaker friends, for this to happen to them, I just thought it was great. It was a great way to do this. So I had to keep in mind, all the stuff that happened up to then, as I said with the X-Files and all that, but I wanted to make it a little bit different. I wanted to make it a little bit unique. So the way to do that was in the wraparound, have the movie stored in the future. Something went on, it's like an apocalyptic future. It's sort of like an homage to The Last Man on Earth. There's this guy living by himself. He's aware there's aliens and they're keeping an eye on him and you're wondering, what's going on. And he's able to basically has this machine, this contraption, and can plug himself in and see these stories that happened in the past that were somewhat pivotal and sort of were representative of what was going on, in the past that affected humanity, which led to this time in the future. So it all sort of makes sense. After you see, the first movie, it's a little bit open-ended, weird stuff happens, but when you watch the other two, you get the idea of what was going on. So I just wanted to sort of thrust everybody in the midst of this, and people could watch it and sort of sort it out, and it sort of added to the mythology of at least, these movies, just like, the Invaders and X-Files, and even a show that started airing right after I released this movie. It was called Dark Skies, and it really had a dark tone. And I love that show, and it was sort of like that's what I was going for. And it was actually the show on network television, doing this exact same thing. So I thought it was pretty cool. Though they took a more historical view starting from the 40s and continuing to the present of the, mid 90s. This one sort of goes all over the place, different time periods and such. But I wanted to, make it a little bit different, make it familiar, and of course, make it entertaining.
Fascinating. Could you speak to the production of the film? You've got some great collaborators, and I love the sets, soundtrack, and the creepy extraterrestrial.
Okay, the production of the film, as I mentioned, I used an already existing short by Mick McCleary. And Mick McCleary is a big collaborator of mine. He's also an independent filmmaker. And he helped me do my first movie, Vampires and Other Stereotypes. He helped build the sets and he helped with locations. And he's actually one of the actors in the movie. He's also an actor, which is awesome. And then in my other vampire movie, totally unrelated to that one, he was the main character. Because I knew what he could do and, he can act and everything. And so that's why he also has an acting part as, the guy at the beginning who's, sort of by himself figuring stuff out. And that's Mick. So, without him, I don't think these movies would have happened like as well as they did because he's very well organized. It's sort of like I am, you just, got to do it. You don't have a lot of budget, but you do the best you can with the budget you have. So, that was awesome to me. And so, technically, when I wrote these, I kept in mind locations that I had. So that whole beginning took place at Mick's house at the time that he lived in, and he had an empty lot next to him in the woods behind his house. So that was all where he lived, his actual house. Then there was the flashback, story, and he shot all that in Atlantic City some years before. And then the story I shot, this other one I shot with called Warm, and it had actress Sasha Graham in it and director Scooter McCrae in a talking, in a role as an actor. So the effects with the saucer were done by Mark Polonia. He did a couple effects. And I knew Mark way back from like the late 80s, I believe. I was introduced to him and I helped him with his movie Saurians. And he did another movie called Feeders, which was another alien movie. So he does some of the effects, and he's gone on to do millions of movies since. He still produces like 5 movies a month, I think, which is sort of crazy. And then I got Tim Thompson, a filmmaker I knew out of, I think, Dallas, Texas. And he did a movie years before called No Resistance, which has some decent effects and sort of an apocalyptic movie. And that was an awesome movie. And I always kept in touch with him. And by then he was doing computer graphics and stuff commercially. And he just sort of did these for me. It was awesome. He offered to do these effects. And I'm like, well, yeah, hey, knock yourself out. So he did like all the point of view of the alien, and when at the beginning when the character's being looked at through like hidden cameras and stuff and weird machinery, it's that of he did all that, and it turned out great. There's a scene with like dead bodies in one of the other segments. Those were all borrowed props that were in other movies. It didn't really cost me a lot to do the effects, except for in a segment with Sasha and Scooter, the one called Warm, whereas with the schizophrenic woman, sort of being converted to one of these worm creatures. Um, I use like real giant mealworms. I use regular worms, rubber worms, some, animation, actually real like claymation for tentacles. And so they had to be all thought out. So, altogether, this movie probably cost like, $5,000 or $6,000. But the idea of it is, much bigger than what it actually cost because, first of all, one of the movies was already made, one of the shorts, and then I just had to make, the other two. And one of them is the wraparound that explains everything. And I think it's, pretty clear, and it definitely has a feel to it. But the alien that is at the end, when, Mick comes out, and it's sort of like the white light, and it's like the stereotypical gray alien. I wanted an effects company who worked on my vampire movie to do it, but they couldn't do it. They wanted like too much money. I was like, sorry, I can't really help you. So I made it myself, and it's just paper mache. It was like a paper mache, basically a puppet. And the dark eyes, because the gray aliens have the dark eyes, it's just a pair of old Ray-Bans that were sort of scratched up. So I built it all around the Ray-Bans, and it was like a puppet head. It was like on a stick, like on a broom handle, and you could turn the head and everything. So I had somebody doing that while I was videotaping it. I think it was actually my sound guy, because I had a sound guy. It was just me and the sound guy, his crew. And to operate it, he was just sort of under something and, operating it by moving the broom handle and sort of, I think he had his hand inside of it to move its head around. But, it turned out pretty good because it sort of blew out the light and you get the whole feeling, it's the alien abduction, the stereotypical thing. So some of those things are like pretty easy to do. And I was happy with everything. There was nothing that I was unhappy about because it was all, planned out ahead of time. And, I would say it turned out, 95% of, what I intended. And I think what Mick wanted to do as well. So, I think it turned out pretty well.
Love it. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Kevin. If you have any last words to share with us, we'd love to hear.
So, so this is the first movie of the Alien Agenda trilogy. The second one is pretty different. Still has the same themes with the gray aliens, and then I introduce these other aliens called morphs. So there's this war going on between two different alien factions, and humanity caught in the middle. And one of them is like the gray aliens, and they use these worms to infect people. And then there's like the morphs, and they're sort of like squid-like things that can assume human shape. So, you know, it's the whole idea of, you could be meeting a human, and they're really like either infiltrated, like a tool of the aliens, or they're actually an alien themselves. And so that sort of keeps everybody guessing and makes the stories more interesting. But everybody in all the movies who actually shot a segment for the movie had all these things in mind. Like there were certain rules that, they had. Like, there's a filmmaker in Florida, Tim Ritter, did a segment. I sort of okayed the script before, maybe tweak something just to make it consistent with the other ones. And even in the last one, there was a segment in Chicago, and I co-wrote the script for that as well. So I had a hand in all of it. I was, directed one of the segments in each movie or the wraparound, but I was a pretty much direct, hands-on producer as much as I could be, with the script. We would okay the script. I didn't go out to, Florida, and I didn't go out to Chicago. I just trusted these filmmakers because I've known them for a while and I knew they could actually do the job, and that was really important. So that was the whole idea of making these movies in the 90s, getting this, collaboration with like-minded people and having fun working on something you wanted to work on, and just being able to share that with an audience, and I think for the most part that really worked well.
Thanks again, Kevin. Stay tuned, stay safe, be kind, and please rewind.